Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, The 5 Non-Negotiables of ERM, a forward-looking program. My name is Jeff Frigsby. I'm the President and CEO of CV Resource, and I will be presenting today's session. First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. In our invitation, we said the session will run about 45 minutes, and we're certainly going to stick to our commitment and stay on schedule. Before I get started, just a quick word about CV Resource and Finance 500. Under common ownership, CV Resource and Finance 500 work with our community bank clients to support their sustainable and optimal financial performance. Our targeted services include risk management, planning, enterprise risk management, and a full array of fixed income solutions. Great. And again, before we get started, just to give you a little bit of feel to get the most out of today's webinar, we do have an instant messaging capability. So should you want to ask a question during the course of the presentation, by all means, feel free to do so. I'll respond as readily as possible. But I also want to mention that there is a Q&A section at the end of the session, as well as this presentation will be available. Should you care to get a copy of it, you can request it via email, give us a call, send us a note through GoToWebinar, and it will also be available in digital and recorded format. All right, it'd be difficult to conduct any risk management focused webinar or session today without acknowledging or to some extent discussing COVID-19. As we go through this webinar, what I will attempt to do is integrate those relevant components. I think it's interesting to be involved in ERM and be in the middle of a pandemic and not take this opportunity to allow the discussion to flow in how ERM supports a bank's ability to respond in a rapid and efficient approach when dealing with unexpected risk. As it relates to the overall webinar, our primary purpose today is really to focus on the non-negotiable components of an effective ERM system, if you will. And if you think about an effective ERM system, think about three things. Think about, is it forward-looking? I mean, there's so many different types of ERM solutions, and they capture inputs, and they have dashboards. But the key component of an effective ERM system is at least creating the foundation to look forward and try to anticipate where risk is going, not just to take a good snapshot of where we are or where we've been historically. So by all means, keep in mind that forward-looking consideration. Also think about its flexibility in terms of creating outputs, and some of you might think of it in terms of dashboards, but creating outputs that can help us form better decisions, right? And so an effective ERM system should certainly be able to present information or outputs in a way that support our ability to make the best decisions we can. And thirdly, it should be a proven process, or even think of it as a discipline that really focuses on supporting sustainable and optimal performance. Now, I think the challenge of any good ERM system is to recognize its risk is in the center of its name. So it is all about enterprise, managing risk. But if we weren't attempting to synchronize our performance priorities, then something gets left on the cutting room floor. So think about an effective system of somehow synchronizing both your risk management and business performance priorities. So those are the things we want to think about. I do want to make one other comment. Not long ago, or maybe it was, but a little over a year ago, or something like that, happened to be attending an ERM conference, a global ERM conference, and the keynote speaker was from McKinsey, and he was kind of leading up to a break, and he wanted to keep his comments brief. So he said, if you leave from this session with nothing else, let me leave you with these thoughts. Number one is ERM is not about risk avoidance. It's about risk management, right? It's about putting the appropriate controls in place to control the level of risk you're willing to take. But his other thing that I loved was he said ERM is about getting more than your fair share in the best of times. And on the other side of the coin, also being the one that suffers the least or thrives in the worst of times. So if you think about ERM, it really helps you position to get more than your fair share in the best of times. And in the worst of times, it allows you to more rapidly adjust so you suffer the least or have the least severe impact. So let's go ahead and we're going to talk about kind of, where ERM is today. We're going to talk a little bit about, what the basics are, types of ERM, the process, things of that nature. We're going to look at 2020 insights, and then we'll spend the balance of our time talking about the 5 non-negotiables, implementing those non-negotiables, and some closing thoughts. So before we talk about the 2020 impact, went there anyway. Okay, well, let's go with this. Actually, what I did want to do is actually shift and talk a little bit about the basics, and we'll come back to the 5 forces. So if you think about it, ERM was formed back in 2004 by the COSO Commission, or the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and they came up with the framework for enterprise risk management. And it was really all about a process affected at the board level in setting and tied to your strategy to ensure that you had the appropriate controls in place to effectively manage the risk associated with you achieving your goals and objectives. In 2017, they revisited that structure and really got a little more focused, right? They took a look at it and said, today ERM is really about including an organization's culture, capabilities, practices, and integrating those with strategy setting and performance that the organization can rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. So as we go forward through this process today, I want you to think a little bit about your ERM system and ask yourself, whatever ERM system you currently have or the system you're looking to adopt, is it focusing on how you manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value? And then if you think about it, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, some people look at ERM from a top-down perspective. Some look at it from a bottoms-up. The approach we're going to talk about today is a top-down approach. But just to give you a little background on both, the top-down approach is really about enabling top management to make better risk-based decisions. That's it in a nutshell. It's about filtering good information up to senior leadership and even to the board about understanding what level of risk you're willing to take, how your controls are working in support of your ability to pursue optimal performance. And that's a top-down approach. It tends to be a little more strategic. When you think about a bottoms-up, which is adopted widely across many banks, I would characterize bottoms-up looking more like a GRC system, more of a government compliance type of system, but it's very robust, right? You can get a bunch of people involved in it. It's looking at thousands of data points, and it's somewhat transaction oriented, but it too is very effective in helping you assess where your risk resides and assessing the level of risk you're taking. Both are widely used. Both are very effective in what they're designed to do. Today, we'll be focusing more on top-down versus bottoms-up. And again, before we get to the 5 non-negotiables, I want to talk a little bit about process. And whatever you do in adopting an ERM approach, think about it as a process. Yes, there's technology involved. Yes, there's potentially consulting involved, but in essence, it's a process, right? And what you're really looking at, and if you think about the terminology that's out there today, and especially if you're talking to your regulators and you're talking about risk management, they want to ensure we all have a system that identifies risk, measures risk, monitors risk, and controls risk. So if you think about it in terms of functional areas of flow, right? Identify, measure, monitor, and control risk. Now, because we're talking about top-down in our system or in our approach today, we're going to talk about the tip of the spear or the front end of that, right? So we're going to talk about, do you have the right governance in place? Have you considered your strategic intent? Have you considered your capital adequacy? Have you clearly defined your risk appetite, which is either explicitly or implicitly expressed in your strategic plan? And have you set up your framework to calibrate or adjust the balance of the process? So when you think of ERM as a system, think about it, setting your framework. What's my appetite for risk? What am I willing to do or not do to make money? How do I identify risk? Do I have a risk assessment system that looks at the inherent risk of the key risks I'm measuring. Does it test my adequacy of risk management? Does it illustrate the residual level of risk that remains? And does it give me a sense of direction? And whether it looks at key risk categories or business lines, you could look at credit risk, inherent risk, liquidity risk, operational risk, compliance, strategic, reputation, cyber, and it goes on and on. You can also look at it from business line standpoints, right? It could be mortgage, it could be trust, insurance. In today's world, with where we're going with fintech and other things, you might have a payments platform. But the identification system is really your risk assessment platform. When you think about measuring risk, it's that further step to take a look at the level of risk you're facing and quantify it, right? And is it likely to happen? If it were likely to happen, how severe would it be? And what's the inherent risk associated with that specific risk? What are my controls with that specific risk? And if there's a residual risk left over, do I have an appropriate risk mitigation and plan to further express or take control of that risk, right? So you've got identify, measure. Monitoring is all about who gets what and when. What's the distribution? What's the frequency? And what's the accuracy of the information? And what do those end users need to make better decisions? And if those things are working well, those three clear steps, then it sets up a system of control, right? By getting that information, it sets up your decision-making process to control your risk and respond to different circumstances in different times. And then if you think about it from a process standpoint, it's an infinite loop, right? It continues to, whether you're adopting technology, you're using a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, or some hybrid in between, think about ERM as a process. So before we jump into the other things, I want to just step back a little bit. I had my slides kind of in a slightly different order. So let's talk a little bit about the traditional drivers of ERM and what's going on today. You know, traditionally, when you were looking at ERM, you were looking at adopting a system that would help you ensure your control systems were appropriate, right? Given your risk profile, do I have the right controls in place? Am I testing them? Am I reporting them and monitoring them? And that was kind of a key driver of ERM. Regulators are kind of a key driver of ERM. Supporting your business goals are a key driver. Enhancing your ability to make good decisions is a key driver of ERM. And certainly, you know, creating or elevating a level of strong risk awareness across the enterprise were key drivers. And if you can reduce operational surprises and losses, that's effective. And if it can help you position yourself to take advantage of key strategic opportunities, those are all the fundamentals that I think have driven adoption of enterprise risk in the past. You know, if we look at today and with the number of banks I've been talking with over the last several months, it's really made me much more aware of the urgency and the importance of having an ERM system when we look at what we're dealing with today. I mean, think about having a system that is a framework for effective risk management and control, and what's happened in the last couple of months. You know, first of all, the pandemic itself threw us into what might be argued is organizational disruption. And to some extent, and at greater and less extent, depending on your bank, through that initial disruption, it certainly has had an impact on workplace safety, employee well-being, customer well-being. But on a performance side, now we're taking a look and what has it done to our credit risk perspective? Are our customers affected? Where are they affected? How are they affected? Can we calibrate that? Can we assess it? So the pandemic has led to two things: a major concern about the quality and performance of our credit portfolio, and probably to a longer term perspective, what's this low interest rate environment going to do, and how do these two huge risk forces impact our earnings over time? So certainly when you think about what ERM might be useful for now is can it help that organizational disruption? Can it help us better respond to the adverse impact in our credit portfolio or in our earnings profile due to interest rate risk? Can it help us better deal with the uncertainty we haven't quite figured out yet as we look forward? And then in addition to that, all of a sudden you're thrown in this pandemic. How effectively are we communicating risk, whether it's across peer level, if it's reporting up to management, if it's reporting to the board, if it's reporting to regulators? You know, does a discipline framework support that? And then the last couple of considerations that I think have changed the sense of urgency around ERM is if you're the CRO at your bank, or if you own risk management at your bank, whether regardless of your position, do you have all the tools at your disposal? Do you have the subject matter expertise and the systems to modify your report tracking and reporting to deal with the current crisis as well as looking forward? And an ERM solution can do that. And then, lastly is good analytics, whether you want to call it analytics, dashboards, reports, whatever. You're dealing with rapid response. You're making decisions at a more accelerated rate. Do you have a system that inherently helps you better aggregate your intelligence to support rapid response and make better decisions? So that's just kind of an observation that ERM's always been a good thing, but I think I found with banks that had ERM systems in place, did it predict the coronavirus? I don't think so. But did it have an infrastructure in place, a process in place, a communication vehicle in place that did things like identify where the risk resides, that identified how you respond to a crisis, that how your business continuity plan comes into place, that how you adjust where your risk resides, and how you report up, down, and sideways, and drawing on better intelligence to make better decisions? I think they would all argue they're glad they had ERM. Their ERM committee alone proved to be a rapid response team. So as we look at today versus historically, I think that does add another dimension as to why I think ERM is useful. So now let's spend kind of the balance of our time taking a look at those 5 non-negotiables. So from my perspective, there are 5 critical components, and if you're out evaluating adopting ERM as a solution, or if you have an ERM solution and you want to test it for its horsepower and its capabilities, these are the 5 non-negotiables that I believe should be a part of any ERM system. And so if nothing else, I hope you can use this data as a filter for those decisions you may be making in the near future. So think about the first 5. So the 5 elements that I'm going to share with you is we're going to talk about risk appetite, right? And we'll talk about what that means. When we talk about risk appetite, it really is more about understanding what you're willing to do and not do to make money. And it's about calibrating a system behind that if you're willing to take more risk to get a greater gain, does your system have the controls and the assessment capabilities in place to help you control that risk? So we'll talk about why risk appetite is a non-negotiable. We'll take a look at the risk assessment platform itself. How do you capture risk intelligence, be it assessing feedback from key risk owners, be it pulling in quantitative analysis that is provided through good analytics? Is it perhaps looking at external market intelligence to help you better understand your environment? But what does that platform do in terms of facilitating the ERM process? The third non-negotiable, as far as we're concerned, is by going through that enterprise risk assessment process, do the top risks that your bank face percolate to the top? I mean, let's face it, guys, we've got probably 100 different risks that reach some level of priority on any given day. But I would argue from a top-down standpoint, there's probably 3, 4, 5 top risks that if they rear their ugly head, they can derail us from getting to where we want to go. So does your enterprise risk management system have a component that says, whoa, this is a top risk, and allow you to assess that top risk? And if the risk is not being controlled at an adequate level, does it feed into a mitigation system that ensures your controls are in place? So that's the third one. The fourth one comes down to tracking and reporting, right? It's just about, and I'll talk about it in a second about who gets what and when. But, have you ever adopted a piece of technology or a system and it seems really slick and it's real sexy and it's real attractive and it does all these cool things that the sales guy tells you? And then you get in front of management or you get in front of your board and they look at all this cool data that you've generated through the system, and all of a sudden you reach that so what moment. So what? So what do I do with it? So the fourth non-negotiable of an effective ERM system is the quality of the information that comes out of it. right? If your ERM system is not generating intelligence that can help every level of management form a better decision in achieving your risk management, your control goals, your business performance goals, then it may be challenging. And we even talk about it having a board-friendly user interface. But that tracking and reporting of an ERM system is kind of critical. And then the last component we like to touch on is just the manageability of it. And I've talked with many CROs and I've heard stories about, Jeff, I bought this system to help, me manage the risk of the bank, and now I'm finding that I'm doing all I can to manage it. And all of a sudden, do you become a servant of the system as opposed to the system serving you? A good ERM system serves you, and it's how it integrates technology and the quality of the subject matter expertise and the efficiency in it. So how manageable is the system? And given your risk profile, if you invest in this great big huge system that requires a bunch of man hours, and you're spending more time trying to feed the system than the system feeding you, then something's not quite right. And if you think back on when we looked at the COSO definition, in the end, ask yourself the question, does my ERM system help me manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value? That is the litmus test, right? So let's just take a quick look at each of these with the balance of our time and talk about how each one plays into it. And so let's think about risk appetite, right? So your risk appetite, simply stated, is the level of risk you're willing to take and prepared to take to achieve your financial and strategic goals and objectives. That's what risk appetite is. What am I willing to do or not do to make money, right? And if you think about it, you can do it by risk category. So the little image you see on the right of the screen there, it says, okay, do I want to take a look and determine what my risk is by credit risk, by interest rate, liquidity, operational risk? Do I want to use CAMELS as a framework? I'm a Fed member bank. FRB's got a matrix, so I want to use their risk matrix. If you're an OCC bank, this is kind of what you're looking at. OCC tends to look at credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, operational risk. They squeeze price risk in there, compliance risk, strategic risk, reputational risk. You might also add IT risk. If you're an FRB bank, you don't want to call it compliance risk, you want to call it legal risk. But anyway, you settle in on what those categories are, right? That's the first step. What is the framework? And then what's the level of risk you're willing to take from low to high? And one of the things that's important when you're looking at your risk appetite is it is articulating what you're willing to do. So now more than ever, and the reason we think risk appetite is so critically important up front is it does serve to calibrate the balance of the system. And let's face it, I mean, and certainly in our case, a lot of our clients, I would say, have what I would characterize above average appetite for growth and earnings, and they're willing to take perhaps above average risk to get there. So if you're willing to take above average risk, so if you're a regional SBA shop and you're running 150% construction land development concentrations, or 600 to 800% CRE concentrations, and I see that all the time for certain clients. The level of controls that you need to have in your ERM system, the assessments, the tracking, reporting, if you run elevated CRE concentrations, is different than the bank that doesn't. If you're partnering with a fintech firm today, and let's just say you're dabbling in the payment systems and you're developing an ISO strategy, and all of a sudden you're seeing your ACH transaction levels on a monthly or quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, going from 2 billion, 3 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion. Are you using a boilerplate risk assessment system, or have you set your risk appetite up in a way so that you can calibrate and ensure that ERM system is fine-tuned to interpret the risk you're willing to take? So that's why risk appetite is on the tip of the spear from our perspective. And you do want to be candid with yourself. If you're taking some serious risk, and a lot of times it doesn't feel like risk because you're so good at it, don't kid yourself. If you're in the factoring business, if you're in running super high, CRE concentrations, if you're doing Bitcoin or cryptocurrency transactions, and or if you're serving multiple banks and dealing with their ALM management challenges, uh, you're taking on a level of risk that may be above average, and you want to make sure your platform can support that. So let's just peel back the onion a little bit further. When you think about your risk appetite, it's not just a risk appetite statement. It is that heat map, right? You want to define what you're willing to not do or not do in those areas of risk. And if you're running 105, 110% loan to deposit ratio to support your growth and optimize your profitability, don't lose sight. You've got elevated liquidity risk, and that should come out in your risk appetite statement. So you want to look at three things when we're talking about risk appetite, right? You want to populate that heat map and bring some intelligence around what level of risk you're willing to take in those key risk categories. You want to develop some risk appetite statements that express and articulate what you mean when you say moderate, high, or low, or whatever in that heat map. And then third, and most importantly, what are the key risk indicators or key performance indicators that can help you figure out where you are within risk tolerance of your risk appetite, right? Those are the three outputs. So if you're doing your own system and you want to make this at home, these are the three things that you want to have included, right? And just bear in mind, risk appetite is associated in many respects with your appetite to do stuff, right? So if growth is a factor and you're looking at modest organic growth, okay, it may not really influence your risk appetite. If you're looking at double-digit growth or certain product growth or certain customer area growth, your growth itself may be part of your risk appetite. If you're into acquiring growth, whether you're looking at acquiring subsidiary opportunities, branches, banks, that influences and that should be reflected in your risk appetite. If you choose complexity in your delivery, if you're setting up a digital bank today, doesn't that change your risk profile than before you did it? And shouldn't that be in your risk appetite? So what's the level of complexity? Could it be the level of complexity in the customers you choose to serve, in the products you choose to provide them, in the channels in which you deliver to them? Each one of those may represent a level of complexity that should be captured in your risk appetite, right? And then from an asset quality, and it's funny, there's an example here of CRE concentrations, and I use CRE concentrations a lot because I guess I see them a lot. But concentrations occur in a lot of places, right? It occurs in deposit relationships. It occurs in geographic locations, in product types. But if you're willing to run certain concentrations, what does that do to your risk? And are you capturing that in your risk appetite? So think about those elements that articulate where your risk appetite is, so that when you've developed that heat map, that next step is, as I mentioned, you go to that risk appetite statement, right? And you really want your risk appetite statement to do two things in real clear fashion. You want it to explain the primary reasons for the level of risk you're willing to take. So if you're willing to take XYZ risk, state it. This is why it's so. And oh, by the way, as long as I'm talking about my risk appetite, let me describe briefly what my control systems look like. All right, so that's step two. So here's a little example of some banks' discussion around their operational risk. And this is what they said. Our operational risk appetite is moderate to moderate high. So they're kind of fence sitting there. But they're saying it's moderate to moderate high when considering our desire to adopt technology solutions that A, enhance our client experience and improve efficiencies. We are also exposed to an increased level of risk associated with ACH and wire volume and size and growing dependency on third parties. So because of that, they think their risk appetite is moderate to moderate high. And then they go on to describe their controls. So when you're thinking about statements, really kind of come up with those 2, 3, or 4 factors that you believe are the reason why your risk appetite is what it is. And then when you get to that third element of risk appetite, spend some time on developing those vital few, right? You don't need a bunch of KRIs, but you need enough to figure out where you're going, right? You want to select what those key risk indicators are, or key performance indicators. We're kind of agnostic on language there, but and then this is all about risk tolerance, right? Your risk appetite might be moderate in something, but you want to be able to kind of take a look at where you move along the tolerance scale, right? Low to high. And that's what your KRIs do for you. And that's the foundation of an effective dashboard. So those are the 3 elements that should come out of your risk appetite exercise, right? And in the end, think of it as a blueprint. So as you identify those key risk appetites, if you find something skewing in that moderate high to high range, then you definitely want to ensure that your enterprise risk assessment is calibrated to make sure it's sensitive to where higher risk appetite exists. So now let's take a look at your enterprise risk assessment framework. And again, we talk about risk assessment, your enterprise risk assessment. You can think about it in terms of a series of risk assessments. You can think about it in terms of a platform. You can think about it in terms of dashboards. But in the end, it's a series of questions and answers regarding where your risk resides, right? However you decide, whether you use camels or this example of risk categories, right? But you want to set up a system that articulates what your risk appetite is, and then flow into your risk assessment itself, right? So if you're looking at key risk categories, and my one reason for showing this slide first is whatever risk assessment you adopt, make sure it rolls up well, that it calibrates. There's a lot of risk assessments that ask a lot of good questions, but then it doesn't kind of spit the information out in a way that's useful. It's just a lot of data, right? So in essence, you want to think about it at three levels, that you have a key risk element or key risk category like credit risk. I'll even show you my next slide. So if you're looking at compliance, that's your risk category, right? But within compliance, well, I've got other entity level risk. I've got my compliance management system. I've got BSA, AML, OFAC. I'm a mortgage lender to beat the band, so I better have a robust fair lending component, consumer lending, deposits, and so forth. So when you think about it from a hierarchy standpoint, your risk categories, that's your first level. The subcategories, what am I looking at within each of my risk categories? And I want to assess what my inherent risk is. I want to assess where my adequacy of risk management is, what my control structure looks like, what my composite or residual risk looks like, and my direction. And if you're an OCC bank, it's okay for this to say, I want to take a look at my quantity of risk, and I want to take a look at my quality of risk management and my aggregate risk and direction. But you want it to drill down to subcategories. And then the natural progression of that is the actual risk element, right? That risk attribute, that risk statement. So I can either read a statement and say, I'm assessing, if this happens to be an example of an operational risk landing page, and who the risk owner is and who the participants are. But I want to answer a question. I want to determine what my inherent risk is. Now, in our view of risk assessment, looking at trends like we have here, where we could look at previous years or previous quarters, that's one thing. We actually think that when you're assessing a given risk in a given category, you should be asking the question of what's the direction of that risk today? Not what's necessarily just the direction of my answers. And that's different. That's a different question, but we think that's important. So when you're thinking about your enterprise risk assessment, think about its ability to aggregate data, first of all, the key risk category. So from a communication standpoint, it aggregates up to giving you macro level, but then you could drill down to micro, right? But also take a look at the quantitative, right? Whether it's credit risk, interest rate risk, do I have my quantitative risk built into that system? And can I look at trends over time and take a look at how my risk tolerances are moving through the enterprise risk assessment? So those are kind of the three primary elements from a design standpoint, but remember, kind of garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that you've got really solid content by risk category. If you guys want a copy of this as a checklist, but as you're looking at the quality of the components or the data attributes of your enterprise risk assessment system, make sure you've got good data. Make sure it's quality content feeding that system. And then one of the things that very few ERM systems have, I don't understand why they don't have it, because you can ask all the questions you want about your own internal capabilities, and you can ask about your what you think things are going to be going on, but do you have quality intelligence that's not driven by somebody's answer to a question, that's not driven by a quantitative historical perspective, but is forward-looking? And there's so many good sources for that, but are you looking at data at a national, state, or local level that gives you a sense of where things are going now over the next 3 to 5 years? That tells you what your market demographics are looking like, or even what the industry is going for. Your ERM assessment system should be answering questions for you about what the future holds and how you're going to respond to that future. Do you kind of, put the pedal to the metal because we got a green light all the way for the next 3 to 5 years? Or do you see some rough waters ahead? Again, I don't know of any system that predicted coronavirus specifically, but I do know leading up to coronavirus, we were on the longest end of a quality, a great economy, a great credit cycle. And if you weren't asking yourself where this great credit cycle is ultimately going to go, you'd be remiss, right? You want to quantify that, though, in your enterprise risk assessment system. So you're looking at qualitative, quantitative, and forward-looking data, and ultimately help you form better decisions as it relates to the risk in your environment. And the last thing, I'll just say, and I'm putting up some reports here. It could easily be a dashboard. It can easily be a Excel spreadsheet. I'm not here to champion a given tool, but you do want to have the ability to get to the useful information in a useful way, right? So this is just an example, again, of a roll-up looking at say, compliance. But what's the aggregate of my risk, and what's the direction of the risk? How well am I controlling that risk? And can I drill down? So can I move up or down? Can I feed my tracking and reporting system so that I can take all this granular data I've captured, but reconstruct it in a useful way for decision makers? And that comes out of the risk assessment system. I talked about top risk, and in the end, as you go through that risk assessment system, it should somehow spit out some emerging risk and threats. And if you're spitting out emerging risk and threats, that's nothing more than potentially something that may represent an area that needs to be addressed, either a weakness you have today or a potential emerging risk or threat that you need to deal with. And you certainly want to be able to categorize those. What are they? Is it a cyber type threat? Is it, an adverse impact, a potential adverse impact to earnings or capital due to a business model that you've adopted? You're an acquirer. You've entered into multiple fintech relationships to broaden your customer base and deliver different product. But those are all, as well as they might be opportunities, they have risk. So you want to be able to identify what those top risks are, where they reside, and kind of grade what their financial impact is so that you can force rank them. And then ultimately take that top risk, ask the question, if that top risk were to occur, or is it likely to occur, measure it. If it were to occur, how bad would it be? Where does the risk reside in my organization? Is it low here and high here? What do my current controls look like? How do I rate my current controls? And is my residual risk okay? Because you can go through this exercise, you don't always have to come up with more things to do. The end of your answer could be, hey, I tested the system and our controls are quite satisfactory, thank you. And we're good. But if they're not, are you nominating controls that could bring that risk into line so it does not disrupt your sustainable performance? And does it move into a risk mitigation plan so that top risk can have specific actions that are associated with reducing the overall risk associated with that threat, right? So think about, if I were to summarize what we just talked about, risk appetite, tip of the spear, enterprise risk assessment, data aggregation, top risk, bang. Am I focusing on the things that could potentially hamper my ability to reach my performance targets? And if I've got those things, can I funnel into a tracking and reporting system that helps me make better decisions? And everybody doesn't get the same stuff, right? So as you think about quality of information and the quality of what your ERM system is generating, again, I'm systems agnostic for the purposes of this presentation. And I don't care if it's the coolest analytics dashboard or if it's some nice Excel spreadsheet that everybody's comfortable working with. But understand that what a board needs to see, what management needs to see, and what's controlled at the committee level or what's down at the risk ownership level is different. And your system should seamlessly move from one audience to another. And just think about that in those terms. So can it populate data that's useful for the board? Do you want to share with the board your top risks, your emerging risk and threats, some key risk indicators, right? How it ties back to performance, maybe what the market outlook is. Well, that's a different type of report than management maybe wanting to get a little further into the weeds. right? So they might look at the board data, but they're kind of saying, hey, let's talk a little bit more about this top risk. Now, bear in mind, a top risk could be you just bought a bank and you have to integrate 150 different systems components that includes staff, that includes product lines, that includes systems, moving into new communities. That's a risk until it's fully integrated and absorbed. So there's common things, but ERM kind of provides you with this enterprise risk look or enterprise wide look at what's going on in the bank, right? In all those key risk categories. And then at the committee level, which I'm guessing for many of the banks I've worked with, kind of bringing back a COVID comment, their ERM committee became the rapid response committee during the pandemic. They already had a committee in place. They already had filters of information and how to respond. So it's kind of handy, right? So those are kind of the construct. And then just make sure, and again, I could have dazzled you with a bunch of technology right now, but I just want to make the point is the information that comes out of the system better be actionable. It better be useful, right? If I'm looking at something as simple as classified exceptions and credit, and if I made a business decision that the market's going to tighten, and all of a sudden I'm looking at our exceptions trending up, my system is saying, hey, didn't we say we were tightening? Help me. And so think of the outputs in ERM by risk category or by a specific risk that, again, that information is being presented in a way that decision makers can make better decisions at every level. Or if it's just a matter of putting this information in front of a regulator. So those are just some thoughts. My last comment on the fifth and final thing is manageability. We're all different. Each one of you in this audience, and I looked at the asset size of many of you, where you're geographically located, the size and complexity of your business model, you're all a little different. And so with that said, when you think about this fifth non-negotiable, think about the manageability of the system you're adopting, right? So first of all, define the role of ERM in your bank. And it's going to be, although the model might be a constant, the degree of the investment and the expectations of the system should be tied back to your business model, your size, your complexity, your risk profile, and your appetite for risk. If you have a nominal appetite for risk and you're in a rural market and things aren't moving a whole lot and you're growing at a comfortable rate and you're making money and you're controlling your risk, your ERM system is not going to look quite the same as and I'll point out a bank. It could be Silvergate Bank in San Diego, California, who is a cryptocurrency platform. And they're a platform for trading Bitcoin. Their ERM system is probably going to generate different information. So define your system, right? And I talk about leveraging technology. Choose technology. It's not the end all, guys. It's a means to an end. But it's the process. It's the interaction with management that makes the system useful. So look at technology from a standpoint of leverage, of is it doing what I need it to do? Is it aggregating information in a useful manner? Is it pushing out information to make better decisions? Think about its utility and invest in it from that standpoint. And look at the subject matter expertise you get with your solution with equal vigor. If you buy a piece of software and you've got to manage it, and you're the CRO, and all of a sudden it's like, oh man, now I've got to figure out how to manage this software, and I've got to get all my guys to buy in, and I've got to do this, and I've got to do that. That's tough. So take a look at your solution and see if there's a subject matter expertise component that provides some outsourced support as well as the in-house expertise you may have. The combination of the two. By the way, if you get a good system, your subject matter expertise will end up being your senior team because they will appreciate the system you selected, right? And that leads to efficiency. So if you've got good technology, it's got a good flow of information, and I've mentioned before, beware of becoming the servant of the platform. But if it's good intelligence and it's doing good work for the bank, your risk owners and senior leaders are going to have greater buy-in. They're going to become your advocates. They're going to be team players in supporting the system. So just think about that in that last step of manageability. So in summary, think about risk appetite, heat map, statements, KRIs, tip of the spear. It calibrates the platform. That should be checklist number one when you're assessing ERM solutions. Checklist number two, does my risk assessment system aggregate information in a useful way in some form of report or dashboard? Is it easy to capture data? Does it equally deal with qualitative and quantitative analysis? And does it give me some forward-looking intelligence, right? And then, does that risk assessment system move into a top risk analysis component so I can force rank my bank's top risk, analyze those risks, and come up with mitigating factors if needed to better control it? And once I've done those 3 steps, do I have a mechanism to control the information and have it flow to the right people so that the right people are getting the right information in a timely, accurate manner to support decision making? And is my process manageable? So I hope in this period of time, I think we're kind of up against the 45-minute mark. My closing thoughts: ERM goes beyond regulatory compliance. It is about optimizing performance. Go with the COSO definition, building value. 2020, call it COVID, whatever. I think the requirements to synchronize risk management and performance priorities are a non-negotiable. They're just critical, and forward-looking is critical. But the ability of your system to be a process, not just a piece of technology, but a process that can help you in the management of creating, preserving, and realizing value are kind of the non-negotiables. So those are kind of my 5 non-negotiables of a good ERM system. I hope you found these, observations useful. We think it makes for a stronger system. Before we get to Q&A, just a quick word about us. This may not be the prettiest slide, but we do provide ERM solutions, and we are client-centric. But we are all about aggregating content in a way that helps our clients make better business decisions. And whether it comes in the form of performance tracking and reporting, capturing data in a robust system, having interactive analytics that you can play with and create good reports, and most importantly, that the process itself has good outputs, right? Compliance-ready outputs. It could be reports. It could be a strategic plan, capital plan as well. But these are our data inputs. It's not just your input. We do have 20 million bank records in CB Bank Analytics, which is our platform. So we can do comparative analysis. But we also integrate 5-year forward-looking from Moody's Analytics. We integrate ESRI data to look at the psychodemographic movement in your markets. We use Info USA to look at what small to mid-sized businesses are doing in every market across the country. We leverage FFIEC data for UBPR data. Like I said, we've got over 20 million bank records in our system to allow you to do your own intelligence gathering and your own comparative analysis. And we use Quote Media for market intelligence. And so if you're a CRO specifically and you're saying, I've got a big cross to bear, I've got a challenge to serve the company by managing an enterprise risk management platform, and if you're doing your due diligence and looking around different solutions, just look at us as kind of like your back office solution. We are the technology, the subject matter expertise, and we are the data aggregator. And so that was just a little bit about us. We hope you'll give us a look. Now, is there any questions that anyone might have? I've seen one on here for a while, and I'll throw that out there and see if we have any others. But one of the questions I have in front of me is if we are looking to adopt ERM at some point in time after I think they mean after we get through the coronavirus stuff. But anyway, before the end of the year, what's the average time to implement what you just described? So I'm guessing you're asking me what's it take to start to finish implement an ERM adoption or implementation. So again, we talk about, if you think about it going from risk appetite to enterprise risk assessment to top risk analysis to calibrating your systems and setting up either a quarterly or whatever the frequency of tracking and reporting is. The world record I've seen on that is a couple of weeks. That's rare. Typically, if I were to bite size it down, it's probably more like a 6 to 10 to 12 week exercise, depending on your bank, depending on the complexity, And a top-down system does require senior management buy-in, or not, I take that back, not buy-in, involvement. So when we support your risk appetite component, there's risk appetite, and that's interactive. It's a web-based action, but it's also facilitated. But if you think about it, you get the risk appetite piece done. The enterprise risk assessment, to conduct all those assessments across the enterprise, might take about 4, 5, or 6 weeks, depending on, again, we're big on promoting involvement. So I'm giving you our time schedule. You'll hear some companies say, hey, you get our software installed, we'll train you on it. You push out the invitations for everybody to complete the assessments, and you're good to go. That's just not the world we live in. So think about it, risk appetite. You'll get that done. It's 4 to 5 man hours, but it'll get done over a week or two. Enterprise risk assessment, somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks. That's not the time it takes. The man hours are much less. It's just herding cats. The third piece, top risk analysis, feeds out of the risk assessment easily, and that's a one-day type of thing. Then you set up your KRIs and you calibrate your dashboard, and you'll have your first dashboard set up by the end of the cycle, which might be, say you set it up in 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks. And then you take quarter by quarter for the first year to reach a dashboard mechanism that makes you happy. Because bear in mind, and if you're looking at our solution, we're really good at board reports. People love our board reports, our management reports, but you're still calibrating, right? So what am I giving to my board? What am I giving to management? What am I giving to committee level? But think about it in terms of if you're really pressed, you can do it in a couple of weeks, but I'd probably say 2 to 3 months is normal. Hope that answers your question. Okay. Great. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found the information useful. Just to let you know again, I know Robert is on the call. If you would like to contact us, it is in the slides, so don't forget that you can request this presentation. You can get the slide deck, or you can get it recorded. But Robert Finch is our Senior Vice President and Director of Sales and Marketing. He supports both CV Resource and Finance 500, and we are poised to work with you in your journey on building and sustaining optimal performance. Thank you very much.